Good evening. Let me welcome you to the Surjit Singh lecture for the year 2017. Dr. Surjit Singh was a professor at the San Francisco Theological Seminary for many years, from 1962 to 1988, after which he retired as Professor Emeritus of Christian Philosophy. He was also the Dean of the seminary from 1972 1978. Well published. He had spent his earlier years in the student Christian movement in New Zealand and India, Burma, and Sri Lanka. And he established, with the help of friends and family, this lecture each year, which has always had an interreligious, intercultural focus, and has had many renowned scholars come over the years, including this year with the presence of Jeffery Long, who will give us a presentation that touches on the Jain tradition. We have had classes in Jain studies for the first time during the last year and a half. And it is our widely shared ambition to establish a chair in Jain studies, and to have a scholar in our presence each year offering insights and courses on that very, very rich and important tradition. We're working with members of the Jain community to try to bring that to pass. So we're glad you're here tonight, and introducing our speaker will be Dr. Rita Sharma, who is our Associate Professor of Hindu Studies and the director of the Mira and Ajay Shingle Center for Dharma Studies, which is a center that focuses on Hinduism and the other Dharma traditions of India. She is a graduate herself of Claremont Graduate University, and she's been with us now 2 years, having wonderful impact on our students and the surrounding community. Rita?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's my honor and privilege to introduce my colleague and good friend, Professor Jeffery D. Long. He's Professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He's associated with the Vedanta Society, and he has been one of the founding board members and organizers of the Dharma Academy of North America, DANAM, which holds its annual meetings in concurrence with the American Academy of Religion. A major theme of Professor Long's work is religious pluralism, a topic he approaches from a perspective informed by the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, and which he also refers to as a Hindu process theology, as well as the insights and principles of Jainism. He has authored 3 books and 2 books that are in process. They are A Vision for Hinduism Beyond Hindu Nationalism, Jainism, An Introduction, which has been one of the most popular books on Jainism, published within the last 10 years, a Historical Dictionary of Hinduism, and his current publications that are in process include Hinduism in America, Convergence of Worlds, Indian Philosophy, An Introduction, and Arise, Awake, Swami Vivekananda Speaks to the 21st Century. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Long. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you for the wonderful, warm welcome. It's an honor to be here at this distinguished institution and to be part of this excellent lecture series. I'm going to start with just taking a little bit of water because it's a longish lecture, so I have a ways to go. But thank you very much for being here. As human beings committed to diverse worldviews, How do we learn to navigate the fact that our neighbors have beliefs and values different from ours, whatever those beliefs may be? Is agreement necessary in order for there to be peace? Or is there a way for us to value difference without compromising on our own most deeply held beliefs? Are there certain beliefs that are incompatible with peaceful coexistence? This evening, I'm going to explore a way to approach these difficult questions. Taking my inspiration from both Jain and Hindu traditions, I will explore the limits of religious pluralism and the role of philosophy in articulating a way forward for conflicted humanity. I've reached a point in my career at which I can never be sure, when I give a presentation, how familiar people are, either with me or my work. To those of you to whom all of this will be brand new, welcome. I hope you find what I have to say interesting and engaging. To those of you who have heard some or all of this material previously, I'm looking at Rita especially, my sincere apologies. When discussing a controversial topic like religion, I find it is always helpful to be clear to one's audience what one's perspective is and where one is coming from before launching into the material itself. I was raised a devout but independent-minded Roman Catholic and grew up in a small town in Missouri. When I was 10 years old, my father suffered a debilitating injury from a truck accident. The suffering he experienced prompted him to take his own life 2 years later. It was from these experiences that my lifelong interest in religion and philosophy emerged. I began a search for answers to the big questions in life and felt I should cast as wide a net as possible, not only studying the teachings of the tradition in which I was raised, but a diverse range of religions and philosophies. And I found much that was wise and true in every tradition that I studied. I was particularly drawn to the traditions of India. In contrast with the view I found among many in my small-town community, that only one religion will lead its followers to eternal life, the others being condemned to eternal damnation, I took great comfort in the words of Gandhi. Religions are different roads converging upon the same point. What does it matter that we take different roads so long as we reach the same goal? In reality, there are as many religions as there are individuals. I believe in the fundamental truth of all great religions of the world. I believe they are all God-given, and I believe they were necessary for the people to whom these religions were revealed. And I believe that if only we could, all of us, read the scriptures of different faiths from the standpoint of the followers of those faiths, we should find that they were at bottom all one and were all helpful to one another. And in the words of Ramakrishna, I have practiced all religions, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and I've also followed the paths of the different Hindu sects. I've found that it is the same God toward whom all are directing their steps, though all along different paths. He who is called Krishna is also called Shiva and bears the name of the primal energy, Jesus and Allah as well, the same Rama with 1,000 names. God can be realized through all paths. All religions are true. The important thing is to reach the roof. You can reach it by stone stairs or by wooden stairs or by bamboo steps or by a rope. You can also climb up a bamboo pole. Each religion is only a path leading to God, as rivers come from different directions and ultimately become one in the one ocean. All religions and all paths call upon their followers to pray to one and the same God. Therefore, one should not show disrespect to any religion or religious opinion. My journey eventually led me to take Diksha, or initiation, in the Vedanta tradition of Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, a tradition committed at its core to religious pluralism, the belief that truth can be found in many religions and philosophies, and realized through many spiritual paths. When I took up the study of Indian traditions as my professional path, I found that this idea of religious pluralism was not well regarded in the academy. Religiously conservative scholars objected to the idea of many true and valid paths, and more secular scholars felt this approach lent itself to a simplistic and superficial understanding of religious traditions in all their rich difference and variety. While I found many of these objections to be legitimate, I nevertheless remained convinced that religious pluralism expressed an important truth, that there is wisdom to be found everywhere, and that the best approach to differences in worldviews is to seek to learn what can from each perspective and integrate the insights of many views into one's own, thus advancing ever nearer to the truth. I also found, as I was exploring the philosophical traditions of India, that the tradition which seemed to have formulated this insight with the greatest logical precision was the Jain tradition. It was in Jain philosophy that I found the conceptual tools for expressing pluralism as in such a way as to address the objections that contemporary scholars had launched against this position. In the meantime, as both my life and my career have unfolded, I've witnessed the world descend ever more deeply, it seems, into the darkness of violence and interreligious conflict. Harvard scholar Steven Pinker has argued, I think very well, that the world is actually becoming less violent. But at the same time, it seems the stakes are ever higher with looming disaster of climate change and, of course, with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It is my view that religious pluralism is not only an important position because it is intrinsically true, but also because humanity desperately needs to find a way to appreciate difference, even on such topics as dear and central to our self-understanding and sense of well-being as religion. The single greatest threat to humanity and to all of life on earth today, I believe, is climate change. Religiously based conflict, however, is a close second. And in fact, it is intertwined with the ecological crisis. If we feel empathy and compassion for our neighbors, it is more likely that we will work together in the face of ecological catastrophe and manage to survive and perhaps even flourish. But if we have already been divided by religious and other ideological disagreements to a point where we do not see the other as fully human, then the struggle has already been lost. It is from this background and perspective that I now turn to the question of how to think about religious diversity and the conflict of worldviews. Why, we often ask ourselves, is there so much conflict, so much violence in our world, especially in the name of religion? Each of the major world religions includes some variation of the famous Golden Rule, the principle that we should all treat others as we wish to be treated. Yet it is the rare religious tradition that has never, at any time in history, been used as a justification for violence against those who are regarded as other, the heretic, the heathen, the infidel. Some would argue that all this irrational violence which goes against the central ethical insights of the traditions in the name of which it is committed, is a reason to reject religion completely. That adherence to beliefs that are incapable of scientific verification does not belong in a society that wishes to regard itself as advanced or enlightened. The irrationality of religiously motivated violence, its self-contradictory and self-negating character, can be traced, according to this line of thought, to the irrationality of religion itself. If this root cause of violence could be eradicated, so the argument goes, violence itself would subside, and we could all share a more peaceful, habitable world. In the words of one of my favorite artists, John Lennon, imagine no religion. Indeed, religion has become a dirty word in many quarters, even among those who find much wisdom in the world's religions, but who prefer to call themselves spiritual but not religious. Religion is simply equated with bigotry and fanaticism. Are matters really this simple, though? One of the lessons of the 20th century should certainly be that ideologies rooted in the rejection of religion are no less capable of inhumanity and of violence on a massive scale than are religious ideologies. Indeed, when coupled with the capabilities of modern technology, the violence undertaken in the name of non-religious ideologies like communism, fascism, and Nazism has in fact taken far more life than pre-modern history's witch hunts, crusades, and inquisitions. Think of the Holocaust, or the killing fields of Cambodia, which lost 1/4 of its population in a frenzied mass murder carried out in the name of an anti-religious political ideology. The evidence, therefore, would suggest that it is not religion specifically that is at the root of violence. Any ideological difference, any difference of worldview can be marshaled in defense of the notion that we ought to kill one another. And we can also observe many historical situations in which there have been diverse religions, and that this diversity has not been accompanied by violence or persecution. In fact, one can point to this very room right now as an example of that. We have diverse religions and worldviews here, but we all seem pretty peaceful. Right? So religious difference is not a sufficient condition for violence. Regarding violence in the name of non-religious ideologies, we're again faced with deep irrationality. For like the religions of the world, some at least of the non-religious ideologies that have served as rallying cries for slaughter are, like the world's religions, rooted in humane ethical visions. Marxism is not rooted in a desire to foment violence, but the desire to ensure that resources are distributed in an equitable fashion. Certainly a noble end with which many religious persons would agree, as the Dalai Lama agreed with Mao Zedong before he realized what Mao had in mind for Tibet. If it is not the religious or non-religious character of a worldview that renders it a possible justification for violence, there must be something additional, something that is projected onto a worldview which distorts it, turning it into something it was not originally intended to be. The modern Hindu sage Swami Vivekananda claims that the source of interreligious violence, and we could add violence across worldviews more generally, is not the worldviews themselves, but rather a set of attitudes that become entwined with them. He defines these as sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism. And he has some lovely quotes here. Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this beautiful earth. They filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now. This is all from his very famous first address at the Chicago Parliament of World Religions in 1893. Broadly, these three, sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism, could be defined as the tendency to fragment a community because of differences in views, a tendency to dislike others because of their worldview or their ethnic or national origin, gender or sexual orientation, and a way of adhering to one's worldview that precludes appreciation for other views. The danger, the seductive power of these destructive tendencies lies in the fact that when one succumbs to them, one feels one is in fact behaving righteously, that one is being faithful to the values that one's tradition upholds. The tragedy is that in so doing, one is actually betraying those very values by embarking on a slippery slope which may lead to hating and killing one's neighbor in the name of a tradition that teaches one to love one's neighbor. One of the great frustrations I have experienced in engaging with people of all religions over the years is the tendency to identify the intensity of one's devotion to a tradition with the extent to which one becomes unhinged and irrational when talking about it. A fanatic is not more devoted to his religion than a so-called moderate. I don't even like the word moderate. It sounds like you don't care, right? It is in fact likely that the fanatic has not understood the deeper nuances of being committed to a view while simultaneously showing respect for other views, even when these appear to be opposed to one's own, while the moderate sees such respect as a duty that follows from one's religious commitment. Why, again and again, do we succumb to these tendencies, to use the Sanskrit term, papa sanskaras, bad tendencies, evil habits? Why do we do this? The thread underlying this unholy trinity of sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism is fear. I got a nice picture here to illustrate fear. Right? Fear that the other will undermine our values, or that the other will take resources from our community, or that the other is evil and means to do us harm. According to the traditions of India, this fear is itself rooted in a deeper ignorance, which is really the root of the evil in the world. One might ask, ignorance of what? The answer is ignorance of our true spiritual nature and the ways in which this nature binds us to all beings. We are all ultimately one. Each of the Indian traditions has its own way of expressing this unity. In the Hindu philosophy of Advaita, the Vedanta, the term for this basic unity is Brahman, the infinite existence, consciousness, and bliss, Anantaram Satchit Anandam, that is the essential nature of all beings and manifests in each of us as our Atman, or fundamental self. The Buddhist traditions speak of interdependent origination or interbeing, praticca samutpada, the basic interconnectedness of all beings. The Jain tradition speaks of the universal reality of the jiva, the life force or soul, which is the essential nature of all living things. Our violence against the other is made possible by our seeing the other as wholly other, as so other that we are blinded to the ways in which we are the same. As the Western philosopher Spinoza observed, our love for others tends to diminish to the degree that they are different from us. At one extreme end, there is the psychopath, who has no regard for the well-being of anyone other than himself. Fortunately, such persons tend to be quite rare, but it is all too easy for many of us to withhold our love from those whom we do not know, people outside of our immediate community of daily interaction. It is even easier for us to withhold our love from people who hold a different worldview, who speak a different language, or who have a different physical appearance from ourselves. Finally, it's even easier yet to withhold our love from living beings that are non-human, and thus to inflict violence, which we would never consider inflicting on our fellow human beings, including consuming them as food. In fact, the ease with which we inflict violence on non-human life is a template for our violence against one another. For violence against our fellow humans is facilitated if we can regard them as non-human, as animals. It is not uncommon to hear enemies in a conflict described as animals. I recall my father, a veteran of the Vietnam War, describing how in his military training he was discouraged from thinking or speaking about the Vietnamese people as human beings. The soldiers were instead conditioned to refer to the Vietnamese people only with derogatory ethnic slurs, meant to render them less than fully human in the soldiers' minds. It was interesting. My father was telling me about this as a child, that this was not simply a habit the soldiers picked up. It was part of their training. They were conditioned. They chanted these things as they were marching, and so on. In the act of otherizing the other, that is, of attending only to the ways in which the other is unlike ourselves, and projecting onto the other only the traits we do not wish to see in ourselves, we commit, one could say, the original violent act, the root violent act. On the basis of this otherization, this literal alienation, progressively greater violence becomes possible. One could say that from bigoted and hateful thoughts flow bigoted and hateful words, and similarly, from bigoted and hateful words flow bigoted and hateful actions. At the same time, valuing otherness negatively and focusing only on the ways in which the other is like us can also constitute a kind of violence. An example of this is the fallacy of colorblindness, in which we assert that we will simply treat everyone the same, perhaps the same as we wish to be treated ourselves. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is Stephen Colbert from his old show. I don't know if you sometimes remember he would talk about his black friend who does not look like he really wants to be there. And the whole joke is that Stephen Colbert is playing this character who really has no concept of what it is to be anyone other than himself. So colorblindness sounds deceptively like the golden rule, except that by failing to attend to the ways in which the other is in fact different from ourselves, culturally, for example, we may end up treating them poorly. Someone might do something in meeting somebody from a different culture that they think is polite or friendly, but that is offensive to the other person. They're not really attending to the feelings of the other. It's necessary to deepen our understanding of the golden rule to mean not only treating others as we wish to be treated, but treating others as we would wish to be treated if we were them, right? If we were under the same circumstances. This brings me to my central thesis, namely that the Jain philosophy of infinite diversity, or anikantavada, can be of great assistance in cultivating empathy, nonviolence, and recognition of the common, fundamentally spiritual nature of every being we encounter, as well as a deeper appreciation for each being's distinctive uniqueness. One can integrate the spirit of this philosophy into one's life without necessarily adopting Jainism in its entirety, although it certainly does invite us to explore the rich, profound tradition in which this philosophy emerged. What is the Jain philosophy of infinite diversity, and how can it help us to follow the middle path between seeing the other as wholly other, thus allowing the other to be an object of potential violence, and of appreciating the other only inasmuch as the other is like us, thus allowing us to resist learning from difference and expanding our view of reality? How can Jain philosophy help us live peacefully with those who are different from us yet share a common spiritual nature? To understand the Jain philosophy of infinite diversity, or as I also have sometimes called it, the Jain philosophy of relativity, it's necessary first to understand some basic facts about the Jain tradition itself, as well as the broader Indian cultural milieu in which it developed and in which it has thrived for thousands of years. The Jain tradition itself is truly ancient. According to Jain teaching, what we now call Jainism is as old as the universe itself, describing the nature of reality throughout all of cosmic time. From more of a historical perspective, some have argued that Jain practice can be traced to the Indus Valley civilization, which was at its height from approximately 2600 to 1900 BC. This is not a widely held view among scholars, given the lack of firm data about the culture of this ancient civilization, and the fact that we're not yet able to read its writing system or even to know definitively which language or languages it depicts. But there are some artistic remains, some elements of the Indus civilization which bear a striking resemblance to items from Jainism. According to Jain teaching, this tradition can be traced to a series of 24 beings who have lived in our region of the universe over the course of our current cosmic cycle, a period extending back many millions of years. The stories of the lives of these founding figures, called Tirthankaras, is difficult to correlate with historical scholarship, but a number of them are attested in independent, non-Jain sources from ancient India. Specifically, the 24th Tirthankara, Mahavira, who likely lived in either the 5th or 6th century BCE, and who was a contemporary of the Buddha. Mahavira, like Buddha, is not a family name, but a title. Just as Buddha means awakened, Mahavira means great hero, and refers to the heroic effort required in the Jain path to freedom from the cycle of rebirth. Mahavira is also known as Jinna, or conqueror, a militaristic image, but one that refers to the conquest of one's inner enemies, including the impulse toward violence. A Jaina, or Jain in contemporary Indian languages, is a follower of the Jinnas. Jainism, Buddhism, and the dominant Hindu traditions of India all affirm that all living beings are far more than their physical bodies. We are spiritual beings dwelling in a physical form that has been shaped by choices we have made while dwelling in earlier physical forms. When our bodies die, our essential spiritual reality continues in another form. This process of rebirth is described in one of the Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, in the following way. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth and then to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change. Becoming a self-realized soul is the aim of all these traditions, though the Buddhist tradition does not use the term self in relation to this process. A self-realized soul is free from the cycle of death and rebirth, having learned the lessons that our experiences as embodied beings teach us. All of our choices, specifically those infused with ego-based desire, lead to inevitable results. The principle of cause and effect that governs this process is called karma, which can be translated as action or as work. One's karma, one could say, is the work one has to do in one's lifetime, the work one brings into one's lifetime from one's previous existence, and that one will carry over into other lifetimes until one has become free from it. This freedom, or moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, is the result of this realization, absorption in one's true nature, called nirvana. This is the ultimate aim of Jain, Buddhist, and Hindu spiritual practice. Each of these traditions can be seen as reflecting different variations on this common theme, and as employing different strategies for realizing this common end. In the Jain tradition, the living being is known as jiva, which can be translated as soul, but literally means living being or life force. There are as many jivas as there are living things, a number that is virtually infinite. Each jiva possesses 4 qualities to an infinite degree, which are therefore known as the Ananta Chatushtaya, the 4 infinitudes. These are infinite knowledge, or jnana, infinite perception, darshana, infinite bliss, sukha, and infinite energy or power, virya. As long as we're bound to the cycle of rebirth, though, we do not realize the infinite potential which these qualities reflect. This is because our jiva has been associated for countless lifetimes with ajiva, or non-living matter. Karma, according to Jainism, is a type of ajiva, which adheres to the jiva as a result of the passions, or kashayas, that we feel when we have an experience. Experiences are of 3 basic kinds: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. The kashayas which tend to correspond to these are respectively attraction, aversion, and indifference. The key to stopping fresh karma from entering one's jiva is to cultivate a state of samayika, or equanimity, whether one is experiencing something that is pleasant, painful, or neutral. Samayika is not the same as indifference, for we feel indifferent to an experience only because we do not feel that it affects us. Samayika is living in the recognition that the inherently pure, blissful nature of our fundamental self cannot be destroyed or disrupted no matter what external circumstances we are experiencing. It is being, quote, alike in pain and pleasure. This means that we do still experience pain and pleasure, but we do not allow them to overwhelm us. The distinction between equanimity and indifference is an important one. If we do not attend to this distinction, we may develop the false impression that we are to be indifferent to the suffering of others. But this is the precise opposite of what the Jain tradition teaches. For an essential element in the cultivation of equanimity is the practice of ahimsa, nonviolence in thought, word, and deed. The feelings that can drive us to desire harm for others attract the most destructive karmas to the soul. They need to be conquered if one is to experience the true, lasting peace of nirvana. Ahimsa is the foundation of Jain ethics. The entire Jain way of life, right down to its strict vegetarian diet, is based on the ideal of ahimsa. Perfect ahimsa is impossible for householders, persons living lives fully engaged with society and which involve earning a material livelihood and raising a family. The practice of ahimsa, to the highest degree humanly possible, falls to the ascetics, to the Jain munis and sadhvis, the monks and nuns. The image for which the Jain tradition is probably best known is of Jain ascetics gently sweeping the ground in front of them to avoid even accidentally treading on tiny organisms on the ground, and sometimes wearing a mupati or mouth shield to avoid ingesting them from the air. I should note here that not all Jain ascetics wear a mouth shield, and that even those who do not do so at all times. And there's some ritual occasions when householders wear them as well. But it's very well depicted in this photograph right here. It may be counterintuitive to claim that a tradition which enjoins such a strict way of life, seeing a thoroughgoing practice of ahimsa as essential to the attainment of spiritual liberation, possesses a philosophy of infinite diversity that can aid in an acceptance of all worldviews. Why is this counterintuitive? It's because one might expect Jains to assert that all other traditions fall short of the practice of nonviolence, and so fail as paths to a higher spiritual state. And indeed, there have been Jains throughout history who have made such statements. Jain reflection on the nature of the jiva, however, has led to anekantavada, the Jain philosophy of relativity. How did this remarkable development occur? Historically speaking, the earliest instance of this philosophy can be found in the Jain agamas, or spiritual texts, in which are presented the Jain community's memory of the teaching of Mahavira himself. In one of these scriptural texts, Mahavira responds to a set of questions posed by a disciple on the nature of the cosmos and the soul. The Venerable Mahavira told the bhikkhu Jamali thus, "The world is, Jamali, eternal. It did not cease to exist at any time. It was, it is, and it will be. It is constant, permanent, eternal, imperishable, indestructible, and always existent. The world is, Jamali, non-eternal, for it becomes progressive in time cycle after being regressive, and it becomes regressive after becoming progressive. The soul is, Jamali, eternal, for it did not cease to exist at any time. The soul is, Jamali, non-eternal, for it becomes animal after being a hellish creature, becomes a man after becoming an animal, and it becomes a god after being a man." Mahavira is here explaining that those who claim the cosmos is eternal and those who claim it is non-eternal or changing are both correct from different points of view. According to the Jain worldview, there has always been a cosmos. It is in this sense eternal. It is not, however, static. It undergoes constant change, its character being vastly different through the various phases of a cosmic cycle, known as progressive, utsarpani, or regressive, avasarpani. It is in this sense not literally the same universe from era to era. In a similar vein, the individual soul, or jiva, is also eternal. It has always existed and it will always exist. It inhabits numerous forms, however, over the course of its journey to freedom. The same soul can be in one lifetime a human being, in another an animal, in another an entirely different kind of being altogether. These forms are not eternal. They perish and pass away to be replaced by another and another and another until liberation is achieved. The answers to the questions, is the cosmos eternal or non-eternal, and is the living being eternal or non-eternal, depend on whether the questioner has in mind the totality of the cosmos, or its current state of affairs, or the jiva as such, or the type of body it currently inhabits. In this way, seemingly incompatible answers to these questions can both be seen to be true. There is that in all of us which is eternal, and that in all of us which will pass away forever. The two are not mutually exclusive. This approach to seemingly contrary answers to the same philosophical question became, in the hands of Jain intellectuals over the course of 2.5 millennia, a complex system of logic, according to which the views of rival systems of thought could be reconciled into an integral synthesis. One of the main debates among the various schools of philosophy in ancient India was over whether the essential nature of reality could best be described in terms of impermanent moments of existence, or in terms of an eternal, unchanging reality on which the illusion of time and change is projected by the mind. Buddhist traditions tended to adhere to the first view. According to Buddhism, it is our attachment to entities that we falsely view as solid and permanent that is the primary cause of our suffering and our bondage to the cycle of rebirth. Hindu traditions tended to adhere to the second view, holding that our true nature is infinite being, consciousness, and bliss, with no real differentiation or division across time. It is our adherence to that which is impermanent and changing in this view that is the cause of our suffering and bondage. Jain thinkers, with their both-and view of the nature of the jiva, as having a nature which is eternal and unchanging, but is also passing through various forms to which it is really and truly and not only apparently bound, asserted that the Buddhists and the Hindus were both correct and both incorrect in the way they described reality. Buddhists on the Jain understanding rightly describe the ephemeral nature of the phenomena the jiva experiences, and Hindu traditions such as Vedanta rightly describe the eternal nature of the jiva's essence. Each was false inasmuch as it denied the truth of the other view. Reality, according to this Jain understanding, is complex. It possesses many sides or aspects, which is the literal meaning of ekanta. An Indian story often used to describe this view is the famous parable of the blind men and the elephant. Everybody know this story? Okay. The story was first told by the Buddha to a monk who was confused by the many views he heard being debated among the followers of different sects. The elephant has many parts: its legs, tail, ears, tusks, and so on. A blind man grasping one of these and taking it to be the whole elephant will argue with those who grasp other parts and describe the elephant in terms of that are different from the first blind man's experience. In this parable, the arguing blind men are the world's religions, or even we could say all worldviews, religious and non-religious. Each religion can be compared to a conceptual matrix for grasping reality. A Christian has a positive experience and sees the grace of God. A Jain has a similar experience and sees the working of karma. A non-religious person has a similar experience and sees lucky chance. If we apply the Jain philosophy of relativity to these three seemingly incompatible views, we can see each as capturing a different part of the reality of the situation. Jain logic allows us to see differences not as conflicting, but as complementary. I have a few examples here that I've accumulated over the years. This is a part that Rita's heard before. But I think they illustrate nicely the idea that seemingly incompatible views, being nevertheless true, is not that uncommon of an occurrence. There's this example of the ocean and the waves. Which is more real? It depends on your perspective, right? If we think of this as an analogy for the nature of being, from a Hindu point of view, the ocean is real and the waves are simply passing through. From a Buddhist perspective, the waves are real and the ocean is an abstraction. So these are both perspectives from which one can view the ocean. Here's a nice one. My students like this one. It's kind of a brain teaser. So you have the traditional Ptolemaic worldview in which the earth is the center of the universe and everything is orbiting around it. And then you have the Copernican view that the sun is at the center and everything else is orbiting around it. Now, which of these is correct? Both. Right. That's right. Now, most of us have been taught that the first view is wrong and that actually we all orbit around the sun. But no less an authority than Stephen Hawking has explained this very interestingly. If you want to calculate the amount of fuel you would need and the trajectory to launch a rocket to Mars, you could do it using the Ptolemaic Earth-centered model of the universe. But the math will be very, very complicated. The advantage of the Copernican model is that the math is much easier in terms of calculating the motions of the planets. But you can accurately predict the motions of the planets using either of these models. It's just one is very, very complicated and the other one's very simple. So science has gone with the simpler version. But in infinite space, there's no center, right? Any spot in the universe you can stipulate this is going to be the center and then calculate how everything else is going to move. Another one I'm fond of, this is from my, this sort of betrays my geographic location. So this is a map of Pennsylvania, and you have to imagine you're all in Elizabethtown, where I teach. And if I ask you how to get to Elizabethtown, or how to get from Elizabethtown to Pittsburgh, if I say, what is the way to Pittsburgh? You're going to say, go west, right? So the way to Pittsburgh is west. But what if I'm in Chicago and I want to get to Pittsburgh? Well, I have to go east to go to Pittsburgh. Now, if we think of this as an analogy with religion, someone might object. Some might say, the one true path to Pittsburgh is west. So if I'm in Chicago, I have to go all across the United States, across the Pacific Ocean, across Asia and Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean, through New Jersey, and then through most of Pennsylvania, and finally reach Pittsburgh, right? This question, how do you get to Pittsburgh? What is the way? Is relative to your starting point. Anekantavada is a metaphysical, what philosophers call an ontological view, a view about the nature of reality. Corresponding to Anekantavada is a teaching called Nyayavada, the doctrine of perspectives. This extends Anekantavada into the realm of what philosophers call epistemology, the study of knowledge. We know the nature of an entity based on which of its aspects we perceive. Each aspect corresponds to a point of view from which the entity may be approached. A worldview is a matrix for grasping reality and grasps those aspects of reality for which it is designed. You could say you won't use a telescope to look at microorganisms and you won't use a microscope to look at distant galaxies, right? These are instruments designed for different purposes. Each worldview is a gateway to insight about a particular piece of the totality of being. Corresponding to both Anekantavada and Nyayavada is a doctrine about how best to make assertions about reality on the basis of the pluralistic understanding of truth that these two doctrines provide. This is called Syadvada, or the doctrine of conditional predication. Literally, Syadvada means the doctrine of Syat. Syat is a word which, in Jain technical usage, means in some sense, or from a certain perspective, recalling Mahavira's account of the eternality and non-eternality of the soul. A claim about reality, its permanence or impermanence, its having one nature or another, are true or false, depending on which aspect of reality it describes. According to Syadvada, truth claims have 7 possible values. In one sense, a claim is true. But viewed from another perspective, that is, in another sense, a claim is false. In another sense, a claim is both true and false. In another sense, the truth of a claim is indescribable. It can't be put into words. In another sense, the claim is true and indescribable. In another sense, it is false and indescribable. And in another sense, it is true and false, and its truth is indescribable. These 7 statements exhaust the possible non-redundant truth values of a given claim. One question that comes up in Jain philosophy is why only 7 truth values? Well, if you start adding more, they're going to be redundant. You could say true, true, false, and indescribable, but the second true doesn't really add anything. So the Jains say 7 levels. The Jain philosophy of relativity raises a number of important questions which need to be addressed if it's going to be utilized as a way to navigate diverse worldviews in a way that's conducive to peaceful coexistence. So I have a picture of poor Kellyanne Conway up here. The first of these questions is the question of radical relativism, which I define as the view either that there is ultimately no truth, or that the truth can never be known, or that the truth is whatever one wants it to be. This, in fact, was the chief objection raised against Jain philosophy by Buddhist and Hindu thinkers in ancient India, that saying the same claim can be both true and false is incoherent. If everything is true, then nothing is true, and one ends up finally being unable to say anything. It's especially important, I believe, in this era of alternative facts, to clarify that the Jain philosophy of relativity is not, in fact, a radical relativism of this kind. So no, sorry, Kellyanne. No alternative facts, right? Jainism operates from what philosophers call a realist ontology, affirming that there is an ultimate fact of the matter, or a way things are. What the Jain philosophy of relativity does is to disambiguate or clarify metaphysical claims of the kind typically made in religious and philosophical traditions, claims about the way things ultimately are. The substance of the Jain claim is that the way things are is complex and not reducible to any single concept. The ultimate fact of the matter is complexity. And even the concept of complexity does not fully grasp the nature of being, which is why, from one perspective, the nature of reality is said to be inexpressible, beyond what limited words and concepts can encompass. Ultimate reality can thus be viewed as both process and substance, both personal and impersonal, or neither, and so on, depending on the perspective one takes. This is not the same as saying reality is whatever one wants it to be. The elephant really does have a trunk. If you say the elephant has no trunk, you're just wrong. The person perceiving it as a snake is partially correct in having apprehended that particular dimension of the nature of reality. If a person who grasped the leg or the ear or the tusk of the elephant said it was like a snake, that person would be incorrect. Their concepts would not cohere with the experience they were attempting to describe. Jain philosophy can be seen as an attempt to systematize and render coherent what the late John Hick calls the religious ambiguity of the universe. By this term, Hick means the fact that no particular worldview has been able to command the unanimous assent of every thinking human being. Certainly, science has been able to produce a measure of consensus regarding the nature of the physical reality which we apprehend with our senses, a reality constantly expanding due to the increasingly refined ways in which our senses can be extended into the macroscopic and microscopic realms. But it has not produced a consensus, even among the scientifically literate, about the deeper meaning of existence, or whether there are dimensions of reality beyond those which are amenable to scientific investigation, or what the nature of those dimensions might be. This remains the realm of religion and, of course, philosophy. One response to this situation is, as with the question of religiously motivated violence, simply to dismiss religion, to say that if there were any truth to the teachings of the religions, they would have come to an agreement by now as to the ultimate nature and meaning of existence. This response, however, raises as many questions as it might ostensibly answer. If the religious accounts of reality are completely false, then this is, as Hick says, bad news for the many. It means we're in a cold universe in which most people have lived lives that have been, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short, who've suffered tremendous sorrows and injustices with no hope of experiencing a better state. Now, the fact that a worldview is depressing and demotivating does not mean it's necessarily false. It's often the case that the universe does not give us what we want, at least not immediately. This conclusion, though, does lead to a particularly difficult version of the question, why bother with anything at all? This is not an unanswerable question. My point is simply that it's not obvious that dispensing with religion altogether addresses our concerns in an adequate way, or that there are sufficient grounds to make such a radical move. Another response to the religious ambiguity of the universe is to cling tenaciously to one particular picture of reality and deny the rest. In fact, the rejection of religious accounts of reality in favor of a materialist view is itself arguably a form of this response. One view is correct, the others are all false. This approach, however, also raises more questions and concerns than it addresses. First, there's the question of how to decide which model of reality is the true one out of all the many options available. Accompanying this is the epistemic question of how one would recognize the true view in the first place. Whatever criteria one would use would inevitably be shaped by the particular cultural location in which one would find oneself. As Hick again puts it very well, had I been born in Saudi Arabia, I would likely believe that Sunni Islam presented the true picture of reality. But had I been born in Thailand, I would feel as strongly that Theravada Buddhism presented the true picture of reality. This leaves us then with pluralism. the view that all these traditions capture some aspects of reality and fail to capture others. The world's belief systems are not the same. They differ in many important ways. They also overlap in some respects, like the famous Golden Rule. Might we respond to the religious ambiguity of the universe by delving into what all these traditions have to say and see how they might be integrated to form a more complete picture of the nature of reality? This approach is described well by Pravajika Vrajaprana of the Ramakrishna tradition. The world's spiritual traditions are like different pieces in a giant jigsaw puzzle. Each piece is different, and each piece is essential to complete the whole picture. Each piece is to be honored and respected while holding firm to our own particular piece of the puzzle. We can deepen our own spirituality and learn about our own tradition by studying other faiths. Just as importantly, by studying our own tradition well, we are better able to appreciate the truth in other traditions. The Jain philosophy of relativity can be seen as a methodology for this process of exploring and integrating the religions and philosophies of the world into a more comprehensive picture. It is possible this process will be never-ending. To claim one has completed it fully would be to fall into the dogmatic error of asserting the truth of one worldview alone. But it can be progressive. In other words, one can advance closer to truth in what Alfred North Whitehead calls an asymptotic approach, mindful that reality is always more than what our words and concepts can comprehend fully, but also avoiding the nihilistic skepticism involved in claiming they're unable to express the nature of reality at all. This can be seen as a middle path between the extremes of absolutism or dogmatism and radical relativism. Does one need to be a Jain to apply the Jain philosophy of relativity in the way in which I have described? Certainly, this approach to the diversity of worldviews has emerged from out of a specific worldview, a specific picture of reality. Also, historically, this philosophy was often not utilized in the way I'm proposing, but as a polemical tool for demonstrating that the Jain view was more comprehensive than its competitors. I would suggest that anyone beginning with any worldview as a starting point might begin to approach the claims of other worldviews using the Jain method, assuming that each view is in one sense true, in another sense false, etc. It would also be a good introspective exercise to apply this method to one's own views as well, seeing where one might have insight and where one's vision might be incomplete. In the words of Sri Ramakrishna, all religious belief systems are, quote, a mix of sand and sugar. One must utilize one's critical capacities in conjunction with what one already knows and understands in order to sift out the truth from that which is a misinterpretation or whose truth is only a function of a particular time and place and may no longer be applicable. Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu, found the Jain approach to difference enabled him to approach those with views different from his own with greater empathy. In an editorial in his journal Young India, he once responded to a question from a reader who had observed that sometimes Gandhi appeared to speak from the point of view of the non-dualistic Advaita Vedanta tradition, and other times from a more dualistic Vaishnava point of view. Asking which of these philosophies Gandhi actually observed, Gandhi replied, I am an Advaitist, and yet I can support Dvaitism or dualism. The world is changing every moment and is therefore unreal. It has no permanent existence. But though it is constantly changing, it has something about it which persists and is therefore to that extent real. I have therefore no objection to calling it real and unreal, and thus being called an Anekantavadi or Syadvadi. But my Syadvada is not the Syadvada of the learned. It is peculiarly my own. It has been my experience that I am always true from my point of view, and am often wrong from the point of view of my honest critics. I know that we're both right from our respective points of view, and this knowledge saves me from attributing motives to my opponents or critics. The 7 blind men who gave 7 different interpretations of the elephant were all right from their respective points of view, and wrong from the point of view of one another, and right and wrong from the point of view of the man who knew the elephant. I very much like this doctrine of the manyness of reality. It is this doctrine that has taught me to judge a Muslim from his own standpoint and a Christian from his. Formerly, I used to resent the ignorance of my opponents. Today I can love them because I'm gifted with the eye to see myself as others see me and vice versa. I want to take the whole world in the embrace of my love. My Anekantavad is the result of the twin doctrine of Satya and Ahimsa, truth and nonviolence. The Jain philosophy of infinite diversity can be of great assistance in cultivating empathy, nonviolence, and recognition of the common, fundamentally spiritual nature of every being whom we encounter, as well as a deeper appreciation for each being's distinctive uniqueness, because it invites us to perceive a universe in which we're all participating, and yet which we each perceive in our own unique way that is appropriate to each of us at our current stage in our journey. It is a method for addressing difference which enables us to navigate the fact that our neighbors have beliefs and values different from ours, whatever they may be. We do not need to agree fully with others in order for there to be peace. But if we can value the perspective of the other as a potential source of insight into the true nature of reality, even if it's not immediately obvious how it might fit with our understanding, our sense that the other is so radically different from us as to render communication impossible is mitigated. It enables us to value difference without compromising on our own most deeply held beliefs, to hold firmly to our own piece of the puzzle, even as we realize that what we hold is only a piece and not the whole picture. Are there certain beliefs which are incompatible with peaceful coexistence? It seems the real difficulty of my proposal is that it requires anyone who might take it up first to accept the ever-unfolding, incomplete, not absolute nature of their own worldview. This is precisely what many religions reject, and this rejection is what many take to define religious adherence, and thus prompts them to reject religion. Many find dogmatic absolutism comforting. Even those who may not be comfortable with it may believe that to question it is to be unfaithful to their tradition. I find this with many of my students. They want to have an open-minded approach, but they're afraid they're doing something wrong if they do. It seems to me, though, that the logic of at least some forms of religious absolutism, those which are coupled with the mandate to spread their beliefs to others, are a recipe for interreligious conflict. Such beliefs have certainly played a massive role in religious conflict historically. My exhortation to those who adhere to religious absolutism is to be attentive to the reality that even the strictest of religions have rich histories of interpretation, of humanistic intellectual inquiry into the teachings of the tradition, of faith-seeking understanding, that is, theology. In other words, and again, to refer back to my students, they think questioning is wrong because they don't realize that people in their traditions have been questioning already for hundreds of years. I chose as my example here for the photograph St. Thomas Aquinas, famous as, of course, a Roman Catholic theologian, but he incorporated the philosophy of Aristotle very deeply into Catholic theology. Aristotle, of course, a pre-Christian pagan figure, and it was an Aristotle received through Islamic Arabic translations of Aristotle. So here you have, even though Aquinas I don't think would call himself a pluralist, but a kind of pluralism, a willingness to see insight and to question. Even if one holds as a central tenet of one's religious faith that a particular text is the Word of God, it remains an open question what precisely that text means and how it applies to the contemporary situation. Divine revelation is always filtered through the medium of language, and languages require interpretation, which lends itself to a variety of possibilities. Diversity is not only inter-religious, but intra-religious. A Jain-style approach to the diversity of views can be applied first to one's own tradition, and then perhaps extended to include other traditions as well. Similarly, the ecumenical movement of Christianity begins among Christian denominations, but it creates the conditions for, in the words of Raimon Panikkar, a wider ecumenism that extends potentially to all religions, as well as to non-religious worldviews and modern science. As an example of this, we can point to this very institution, GTU, which began as an interdenominational Christian institution and is now extended to include centers that include theological work within other traditions, Islam, Hinduism, and so on. That people holding diverse worldviews ought to strive to coexist, and that it is important to approach different beliefs in a spirit of respectful and open-minded inquiry is not controversial, though it appears to be becoming increasingly radical in the current political climate. What Jainism lends to this conversation, in my opinion, is a particular precision and a powerful logic which demonstrates that pluralism not need be simply a platitude, a nice politically correct sentiment. Let's all get along, right? But it can be a major contributor to understanding on a global scale. For here we have a model of knowledge unfolding through an ongoing dialogue of worldviews, each integrating the best of the others into itself, and perhaps all one day converging in a shared, multifaceted vision of truth. And so my remarks end here. Thank you very much.
I know you would rather ask questions or make comments from where you are, but by using this microphone, then we'll be able to capture it and become part of the historic record so that other people who will view this later will be a participant. So if you have questions or you want to make some questions and comments, why could you please make your way to the microphone? And we'll have maybe 20 minutes or so if we can endure. Yes, come.
I stuck to the time. Not too bad.
I have, I think, a pretty simple question, and that is there like an analog, perhaps, within, I guess, the general academic community, not theological community, to sort of uncompatible, where they could perhaps meet theology, like we could meet each other halfway and have dialogue?
Okay, that's a great question, and some of you may already know this, some of you may not, but the wider Academy of Religion is sometimes quite suspicious of theology and constructive work, so it's not only interreligious conflict that we have, there's even within the Academy we have different camps and schools of thought. My greatest hope here, I think, is in the fact that the humanistic ideology to which I think the vast majority of the academic community is committed also involves a commitment to multiculturalism. And I think if we can present theology coming from many traditions as an important contributor to the public discussion and attempts to therefore remove it or not allow and include it as really a kind of anti-humanistic move, kind of a totalitarian move, I think that gives us at least an argument that we can present. I've had this particular argument with scholars of religion, and a few of whom have come around to agreeing with me that those of us who want to carve out more of a space in the academy for theological and other kinds of constructive discourse aren't insisting that everyone do that. And this is kind of an interesting, this is sort of a difference between, I think, Indian and Western cultures very often. And I've become rather Indianized in this regard, or maybe I always was. I never assume that what I am proposing or doing is what everyone has to do. I think this works for me. Whereas I think very often in the West, we tend to universalize our claims. I was having a chat about Immanuel Kant with Rita earlier today, and just the fact that we were talking over lunch. The idea of sort of universalizing any sort of claim you make makes people think, oh, you want us all to be theologians. And there was a discussion online among scholars of religion in South Asia where I was arguing for these approaches, and there were people who said, well, I don't want to do that. And the response is, well, no, but let me do it. And if you're not letting me do it, then you're in a hegemonic position. And that's something no scholar wants to be in, right? Because we're supposed to be against hegemony and against those kinds of things. So I think that's what we have to do, to say that this is part of multiculturalism. This is part of freedom of expression and allowing people to be who they are. And the fear is, of course, theology within one particular tradition in many cultures has been itself a hegemonic discourse. And the contemporary academy sees itself as having liberated itself from that. So they hear the word theology, they're afraid we want to go back to the Middle Ages. We're going to go back to Thomas Aquinas. And not in every respect, right? The idea is to have that be one more piece of the conversation, but certainly not excluded from it.
Thank you.
It's okay for more of you to work your way up here and wait your turn. I just wanted to say one thing, that when you had come. Okay. It's more of a comment, but observation. We were celebrating the role of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology was one of the early participants in the GTU, formation of GTU. and they were kind of explaining this and went back to a portion of Thomas Aquinas where he argued that since God is manifested in the world, if you have a particular perspective and I have no interest in it or think it's wrong, then I perhaps miss some manifestation that would bring either modification of my own position or a purer truth, or however you would say it. So you have to be constantly open and searching for that dimension that you do not have of yourself personally and privately. And so in some of the foundational documents of the Dominicans about the GTU, they argued at one place, until we open our faces to Asia, and meaning what we're trying to do now, which is to bring these rich traditions of wisdom and religion into the GTU, you'll be, if you will, impoverished.
Right.
Yeah. So
that's very much in the spirit of what I'm saying today. And in fact, this back to the first question, another sort of academic equivalent of Anikantavada is this idea of human fallibility. That Aquinas is talking from the perspective that human beings are not omniscient. He didn't know about Mahavira, but human beings are not omniscient, and therefore we need to talk and listen to each other. Right. And I think Professor Jaini wants to. Yes, we have a.
My question was, I really appreciated this. It really speaks to me, and
Thank you.
But my question is about sometimes the need for conflict when a dogmatic view sort of imposes itself through power.
Yes.
Islam is often misunderstood as absolutist and expansive, but in its historical context, you could see it as a form of resistance to absolutism.
Right.
Of the religious orthodoxy in the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
So see Islam as creating a space for a view that had been defined as heretical.
Right.
So at what point, how do you incorporate that, or what might have been another peaceful, nonviolent response?
Right. No, I think this really requires a great deal of discernment. And another aspect of Jain philosophy that's very strongly emphasized is that the Nyaya, the perspective from which one views an issue, is a condition of things like time, space, our location in the cosmos, our location in history. And so I think it points us away from what scholars often call essentialism. So, for example, if someone wants to say that Islam is this sort of hegemonic, dominant tradition, and then someone wants to say, well, no, Islam is a tradition of resistance. Well, if we look at Syadvada, it's like, well, in one sense this, in one sense that. In other words, and then if we fill that out with what are the conditions, well, there have been conditions in history, times and places where just about any tradition you can think of has been dominant and hegemonic, and times and places when it has not. And so it pushes us away from these kind of simplistic definitions of something as essentially this or essentially that. I would say no tradition is essentially hegemonic, but any tradition can be made hegemonic under certain conditions. And no tradition maybe is inherently a tradition of resistance, but it can be deployed as one in the right circumstances. I had a really interesting conversation about this with a colleague, former colleague. He went off and became a musician, a professional musician, having a lovely career now. But he's from South Africa, and he was Hindu and is Hindu. And it was very interesting to talk with him about his Hinduism, because unlike Hindus that I've known from India, where Hinduism is the dominant tradition, there's a certain kind of attitude that comes with being the dominant tradition, that you can take certain things for granted. Of course everyone celebrates Diwali, that type of thing. But my colleague's Hinduism was very much a Hinduism of resistance. And it was a Hinduism that was practiced by a minority community that suffered under apartheid and was part of the struggle with apartheid. And in that struggle, they found their Hindu practices and customs to be something they tapped into in much the same way that one finds the Christianity was tapped into by the black church in America for the purpose of resistance. So it's very conditional, I think, and that's what we have to attend to. Yeah, no essentialism. I can't stand it when people want to simplistically pigeonhole religions into, and of course they're trying to create heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. But we've all been very good and we've all been very bad at different times in history. It's something we have to be attentive to. Mr. Shah?
My question is really practical aspect of it. You mentioned that you have students
Yes.
who feel that if they'll open up their minds, they are doing something wrong against their faith.
Right.
Or they don't want to open up because they're afraid
That's right.
that they will lose something.
Right.
How do you answer it? How do you convince them that they should keep open so that they can learn from the course that they're taking?
Right.
The reason I'm asking is, we all have the same issues. Some people in our congregation come with an absolutist view.
Right.
And how do you, I can learn from you as to how to convince them to open their minds.
Right, right. Well, it depends on the circumstances, but I can certainly make a few generalizations. You have to handle all these situations with compassion, not to ridicule those beliefs. Oh, how silly that you think that, but to take it very, very seriously. And the conversation I actually very often end up having with students is they'll come to me sort of rather angry and upset with their parents or their tradition for having put that fear into them and say, oh, how they should be more open-minded. And I tell them, well, you need to be also compassionate to them, that they are operating out of their particular understanding, their worldview. And so compassion means you don't necessarily have to agree with them, but that we don't ridicule. We don't say, oh, well, that's stupid or that's wrong, because that could have come from an experience that was very traumatizing for a community. I come from Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, where a lot of Anabaptist groups fled from persecution in Europe. The Amish, the Church of the Brethren, which started my college, the Mennonites. And sometimes those of us who are not from those traditions might think, oh, they seem very insular and they don't seem to trust the outside world much. But in one of the buildings in our campus, they have some pictures that are from an old book from the Church of the Brethren called The Martyr's Mirror. And it's depictions of the tortures that these people experienced in Europe at the hands of the Catholic Church and other Protestant churches that didn't agree with them. The Anabaptists were sort of the most persecuted, I think, of the Christian groups in Europe. And there are these pictures of people being boiled alive and really terrible things. And you think, okay, if that's the experience of a community, that gets passed down in various ways as attitudes of distrust, as a sense that the other is an oppressive force and we need to, fear it on some level. And so I think we have to have a lot of compassion. And when people understand that you're respecting them and that you're compassionate, then they're much more willing to listen. They feel threatened by a position if it seems to be, being pushed on them very aggressively. But, yeah. Sorry? That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's what you have to have. Exactly. Yeah, there's an unfortunate tendency to, demonize people that disagree with us, and I try to remind myself that there are no bad people, or maybe there are a few, but very few bad people. But there are a lot of bad ideas and a lot of bad attitudes, and we need to root those out in others, but also in ourselves. And I think that's an ongoing process.
Thank you for the fascinating lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So just extending on the practical aspect of this, I mean, you give some examples of how strong the human conditioning is, right? So given that, is this really a theoretical exercise, or can this really be applied? And have you seen, or can you draw upon any examples of where we actually can use something like an example?
Yeah, no, this is the question that haunts me most. I mean, this is, people use the expression, this is what keeps you awake at night. This literally keeps me awake at night sometimes. That, especially at certain phases of my career as I have written about these things, maybe I'll be in the middle of a project, maybe I was writing the Jainism book or writing a presentation, and then some horrible thing will happen in the news. And I'll think, is this doing any good at all? I'll go give another talk. A few people who probably already agree with me will come and like it, and that will be it. And I'm beginning to lean toward the view that some kind of comprehensive educational program based on these principles needs to be developed. Maybe at GTU, somewhere. We've also developed an interfaith studies, both minor and major, at our college as well. And in as much as I contribute to it, I try to shape it as much as I can based on these principles. And I think that's really education, I think, is the key. And I think we also have to be very patient and not too utopian, that even if you just reach one person and change their perception, that has a ripple effect on the people in their lives, on future interactions that they may have. And so we do need to, I think, make a deliberate effort to communicate this. And I think that this touches not only on philosophy, which is more my expertise, but also psychology. How do we cultivate these ideas in ways that they become what we call sanskars in Indian traditions, right? Mental habits that just become part of our character. And so, and I think we need to bring some type of values education back into higher education. This is probably not a controversial thing to say at GTU, but in the wider academy and in the universities, it's just not present. We train people to get a job, which basically means our education serves the economy, but it says nothing about the ends toward which that job might be aimed. So someone might be a very good student and end up being a very good, to take an extreme example, a very good torturer or something like that. Then we would have failed, right? So that needs to be incorporated. And I think the worry about values education is that it loses its secular character, that it becomes dogmatic. And I think that's why something like Anikanthavada is essential, because then you can develop a pluralistic, right? Not a secular as such, but a pluralistic approach to values, so that you can't be accused of preaching Christianity, Jainism, Islam, Hinduism, because you're drawing from all of them and saying, look, these are human values.
So this is sort of a comment / a question, either or, both and kind of thing. Okay. I'm not a scientist, and I'm new to Jainism, right? And as I was listening to you, it sounds like Jainism is an even more sophisticated way of, again, describing the reality, right? You have, often people say it's either or both and, but here it's either or, both and, it's all combined, right? It's a very sophisticated understanding of the humanity and the world, right? The question is, have you tried to kind of tie that to sort of modern understanding of the physical world? Because again, I'm not a scientist, but the way the modern scientists describe the world is so much more sophisticated and complex than we ever imagined, and often. Most people are stuck in, Newtonian physics, right? Mm-hmm. But when you go into, quantum physics and so on, both and is like the norm.
That's right.
I mean, it's not either or, both and then some, right? So what I'm saying is, I feel like the science is getting more and more sophisticated, trying to describe the physical world. Right. And they recognize that it's not on and off either or. Right. And one of the things that I still remember, sort of enlightened moment that I had as a college student, was when I was told that the light, which moved at the speed, at a constant speed, actually is both particle and behaves like a wave. Yes. And that just blew my mind. Yes. That what seems like something that's constant has variables and has different forms and so on. So what I'm saying is, have you thought about tying Jainism with a modern understanding of physics, right? To explain to the audience that in fact this is sort of a sophisticated, a very complex way of understanding the reality, just like the scientists are trying to understand a very, very complex world that really is far beyond, what Newtonian physics can describe.
Right. No, I agree with you very strongly. In fact, I had the privilege of speaking at a conference on Jainism and science at IIT in Mumbai last January. January 2016, and touched upon some of these topics. I'm always cautious about it because I'm not a scientist. It's like, that's that thing, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV, So I read a lot about science, and I enjoy it, and I'm a big, Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson fan. But I do feel I need to be cautious when I make assertions like that. But I've had some interesting dialogues with both a philosopher of science and a physicist at my college who are interested in these issues. And in fact, the philosopher of science read my dissertation, and he said, this sounds like, quantum, it sounds like quantum entanglement and, both wave and particle kinds of things. And at the very minimum, I would say quantum theory gives us very nice analogies that we can, maybe even better than my Ptolemaic and Copernican system, where, reality really does behave in ways that are prima facie contradictory. And that's what Anikantavada says, that is how reality is, that it can't be reduced to one set of categories. Whether the light appears as a wave or appears as a particle is not random. It depends on the matrix one uses for observing. It depends on how one observes and even the question one has in one's mind, right? It's the very attempt to measure that influences the outcome. And I think at the very minimum, as an analogy, maybe maximally it says something very profound about human epistemology and how we know. But at the very minimum, it's a great analogy, I think, for looking at the religions also as akin to instruments for apprehending reality. And so just as with quantum observations, the instrument you use and the way you set up the experiment shapes the outcome. So if a human being trains her mind over the course of a lifetime of Hindu practice, and another human being trains her mind over the course of a lifetime of Islamic practice, those minds are attuned to spiritual reality in specific ways that are going to then apprehend dimensions of that reality that are maybe not completely unique to those traditions, but certainly are shaped by them. So I think it's a very rich area, at least for comparison and contrast. Maybe even something more beyond that, but I would want more scientific training to be able to say anything authoritative. But I think yes, and I do think science has to be part of the conversation. So I often will use the term religious pluralism, but really I'm thinking of worldview pluralism. Not only the world's religions, but non-religious philosophies and science as well. Because it's all knowledge. That's my sense of it. It's all knowledge.
Hi, thank you. This was very interesting. In the Middle Ages, when I was an undergraduate at Notre Dame,
I'm from Notre Dame too.
we learned about natural law.
Yes.
And you were talking recently about values. And the way you were talking about them, I almost got the impression that there was an assumption that values are commonly held somehow. Mm-hmm. When I was in law school, I tried to do some research in anthropology to figure out at least what various cultures felt. And I could only find one thing that seemed to be commonly held, and that was that murder was in most cultures. Something that was at least frowned upon.
Right.
But as you go through this relativity kind of thinking, at the same time you say we have to teach values, do you believe, or does Jainism come to the conclusion that there are some common human values that transcend these various cultures or that bind these various perspectives?
I would say, certainly in terms of Jainism, yes. The concept of karma is universal, and in fact, not only universal to human beings, but includes animals, plants, even forms of existence that we don't normally think of as living. So this principle of karma is seen as a universal thing. In fact, this is generally true of the Dharma traditions, the traditions of India. Not all of them, but a good many of them tie the value system with the ontology, with the metaphysics. So it's the idea that values aren't simply a human construct, but that they in some way reflect the nature of reality itself. So that you could, in a sense, have almost a science of values, one could say. I think the closest thing to that I found in Western non-religious thought is the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, because he has an understanding of God which is not really the traditional theistic God of classical philosophy or of Christianity, but it's more a kind of mind of the universe. And Whitehead understands God as valuing certain things, and those are then intrinsically valuable. Now, our ability to apprehend that is, of course, varied with our intellectual development, the culture we inhabit, our religion, and so on. So I would say for myself, I'm operating with a sense of values as maybe something akin to Platonic objects, which we only perceive dimly, but which we can see reflected and refracted in various ways across the world's religions and value systems. And like you said, there is the prohibition of murder is very widespread. The golden rule, or some variation of it, is very widespread. And I think this is, again, a process of discernment. But on one level, I'm also a pragmatist in the technical sense, a William James pragmatist. When I was thinking of values in the context of the university, I was thinking, what do we need to inculcate into young people to survive as a society and as a civilization? So that would be a pragmatic sense of value. And I think we can, without getting into all the metaphysics, we can stipulate that a society in which people not only respect, but actually value one another's belief systems as potential sources of wisdom would be a pragmatic good, that it would lead to a more flourishing society. I think the idea of tolerance has sort of worn itself out. I mean, it's better than intolerance. But Swami Vivekananda observed it back in the 1890s. If I say, I tolerate you, I'm basically saying, well, I'm not killing you right now, And that's, as I like to say this to my students, I say, if you went back to your dorm this evening and your roommate said, I tolerate you, would you feel comfortable going to sleep in that room? I tolerate you is not a compliment, but I accept you. I find you fascinating. I want to learn from you. Now, we like hearing that, right? This is a more of a value system, I would say, based on this idea of acceptance and willingness and desire to learn from the other. And I think, even if we don't get into the metaphysical questions, I think just on a purely pragmatic basis, we could argue for that.
This, I think, will be the last question, and then others of you can certainly approach Jeffrey and have a conversation for a short time afterwards.
Okay. Hey, hello.
So Dean Kim raised a question about the sophistication of Jainism. My thoughts were on the opposite spectrum, in the sense that I thought of an objection of the possible trivialization of a certain position, and I will elaborate.
Yes.
So earlier in the slide presentation, there was a description of truth that I was struck by. And I don't remember the exact description, but it was something like a proposition, the truth of a proposition is true in a certain sense, in a particular respect, from a perspective. It was something like that.
Right. The sevenfold truth. Right.
And I just thought, well, what if someone objects and says, well, that claim is true in a certain sense from a particular perspective? It seems to trivialize the position of Jainism.
Right.
So I was just curious, how would you address that objection? Is my question clear?
Right. I think it's clear. I'll start answering it if I'm wandering too far.
Well, it's sort of like the claim, all truth claims are relative.
Right.
Well,
and then that becomes itself relative.
Either that claim is true, and if it is, it becomes self-refuting.
That's right.
Because then it's absolutely true.
Right.
And then if that claim is relative, then it's only trivially true.
Right.
That's just what I thought of when I saw that. So how would you address that objection?
Okay, well, there's how I would address it, and there's also how the tradition addresses it. And I'll talk about the tradition first, because the question does come up. And it's a question raised both by objectors from outside of Jainism, and also Jains themselves were thinking through these things. One big question that comes up in the Jain tradition is the extent to which this sevenfold understanding of truth applies to the teachings of Jainism itself. So, for example, the central Jain ethical claim is ahimsa, which, if you wanted to put it in the form of a proposition, could be that it is always wrong, it is always morally objectionable to inflict suffering upon another being. So, like, you take a claim like that. And there's an author named Samantabhadra who wrote around the 5th century AD a text called the Aptamimamsa, and he took the sevenfold predication and applied it to a series of claims, propositions, some of which are common property among the Indian traditions, and some were specific to Jainism. And when he came to the question of violence, his response to it was very interesting. He said, from a certain perspective, the claim that one must always observe ahimsa is true, and he just took that to be obvious because it's such a central Jain tenet. But then he says something else interesting. So in what sense is that claim false? You might expect him at that point to talk about self-defense, and there are Jains who've talked about the idea of self-defense, that for at least for non-ascetics, that it's acceptable and maybe even mandatory to engage in violence to prevent greater suffering if you're a householder and your home is being attacked or something of that sort. What Samantabhadra says from the perspective of an ascetic is that violence directed against others is always wrong, but violence directed against oneself for the sake of moksha, and by this he's referring to the very difficult ascetic practices like the long fasts and so on, very uncomfortable things that Jains will take upon themselves. He says to do that is always commendable. So that's an example of where he's taken what you might think of as an absolute claim and shown that it can be viewed differently even within the tradition. The other thing that's interesting and I think important to point out about this application of the sevenfold model is that it doesn't go on perpetually. That there's a point in the process at which one reaches what one could call an absolute truth. So that you don't just sort of keep applying it again and again, but you reach a certain point where you have sufficiently disambiguated the philosophical statement that you have now come to a position of truth. And that's why I made the point about this not being a radical relativism, because there are points beyond which the tradition says, well, no, now you've reached the basement, in effect, of digging into the truth matter. And there's also some discussion of what kinds of claims is the sevenfold model applicable to, because it's not applicable to all claims. And of course there's a question, is it applicable to itself? I played with this idea a little bit in my dissertation and thought, well, you could say that, like if we phrase it simply, that the truth of all claims is relative, and then apply that to itself. Now, in one sense, you could say it refutes itself, but then you could also say, well, what's the opposite of a relative? What is a non-relative claim? It would be an absolute claim. So if one applies the claim that all truths are relative to the claim itself, then it is rendered an absolute claim, which in one sense contradicts it, but in another affirms it. It makes it a universal claim. Now, I didn't do any more with that because it hurts the brain after a while to think about this. But I will tell you, there's a freshly minted PhD from Claremont, Andrew Schwartz. He's now the director of the Center for Process Studies. I was a reader on his dissertation, and he found that to be the most interesting thing in my dissertation. And he's built a whole dissertation on the idea of true paradoxes. And he gets into something called dialetheism, which is the idea that there can be true contradictions. It's quite a controversial field in the field of philosophy, and the term often used also is paraconsistent logic, so that there's a deeper consistency beyond the surface level of consistency that we generally expect from philosophical statements, that there can be, on their surface, contradictory claims that within a larger context could be seen as paraconsistent. They're consistently true within that larger system. The only way I gestured to that in this presentation is with my analogies. What's the one true way to Pittsburgh and that sort of thing. Those are fairly easy to disambiguate. But this gets much harder when we get to the sort of core ontological claims like you're talking about. So I don't know if that quite responds to your question, but yeah, Dr. Jaini.
I'll bring it to you.
Very good.
Well, Jains are flattered when their doctrines are applied by non-Jains for worldly problems to solve them.
Yes.
Isn't it true, Jains? You are a Jain, and you feel that way, don't you? Yes. Why? Because we think that, look here, how wonderful our religion is, others are using it to solve their problems like that. So, such flattery doesn't do any good to Jains themselves, I tell you. Anekanta doctrine was not developed for solving world problems.
I agree.
Or to tell you how to deal with the religions which are challenging your own doctrine, etc. So, this Anekanta was used most of in the books Aptamimamsa and all that we have to show how the alternative to Jaina doctrine is wrong.
Right.
And by showing that they are wrong, between the two options, that why we are right, Anekanta was established. So, but does Anekanta inform our attitude to people? Does it occur to me that because I believe in Anekanta, the person who is wrong, Ekanta, I should tell him, you are also right? No, it can't be done. Or because he believes he is right, what should I say, believing in Anekanta? For example, Brahmin, I'm not talking about the Western world.
Right.
The Brahmins used to offer sacrifice, animal sacrifice also. So, yajnarthe pashavu srishtaha, Gita says, animals were made for sacrifice, etc. So if he says so and if he believes this way, and if I say this is wrong, what should I say? That Ekanti, you are right, but still from your point of view, you are right. What does it mean? That's nonsense. Jains were openly saying you are wrong. And we are right because, etc., etc. So Jains have examined their own doctrines also. So what I'm trying to say to you is that what you are doing is a great service to Jainism. It's okay. But don't be misled by thinking that indeed the Jains are so open-minded and that they are so embracing all the other world religions. That look here, you are also right, you are also right, you are also right. They don't say these things, although they should probably say. I'm not saying that. But this is something new for Jains to hear. Right. And so, how do the Anekanta does in a way, the spirit of Anekanta does in a way, not openly, inform our attitude to other people. And this is explained in the Buddhist, Jain, as well as Brahmanical. In the 4 bhavanas which are called, and these bhavanas are, first one is called Maitri, friendship towards all. Maitri, basis of all, to all beings. And beings in Buddhism, Jainism includes animals and everyone, up to the animal, up to the vegetable level. Satveshu Maitri. Towards all beings, my attitude is Maitri. Why? Because they are also suffering like me. They are also bound in the same bondage as I am, that they are capable of coming up. And so this value, that all beings are potentially capable of attaining the same goal, etc., etc. This is the Anekanta, spirit informing without saying, openly certain formulas.
Right.
And this Satyeshu Maitri, Vyakti me sava bhuveshu. I have friendship towards all bhutas, means beings.
All beings, right.
Veram majja nakenavi. I have no hostility towards anyone. This is the primary Jaina teaching. So, but having said that, you can't have friendship with everyone. Then Satyeshu Maitri, because in the society that we live, Gunishu Pramoda, those who are more virtuous than you, in keeping the etc. You should have Pramoda, you should have rejoicing in that. These are the attitudes I'm talking. These are the attitudes to be strengthening your ahimsa, etc. And then comes the third one, Satyeshu Maitri, Gunishu Pramoda, Krishteshu Jiveshu, those beings who are suffering physically, mentally, in every way. What should you have? Karunya, Kripa Paratva, you should have compassion. You should not hate them. You should not have disgust towards them. You should not turn away and go away. At least have pity. That's the one. Then the last one is the most important one. And that is Satyeshu Maitri Gunishu Pramodam Krishteshu Jiveshu Kripa Paratvam.
Compassion.
Then the fourth one is the important one. I know in my heart that several religions in India, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, this and that, and all sorts of people which have doctrines, including Vivekananda, including Mahatma Gandhi, everyone. They mean well. They are saturated with the spirit of friendliness. Yes. But in reality, Vaishnavism is not simply saying we are all the same.
Right.
Just as we will not say openly that the beliefs of Christianity, the beliefs of Islam, the beliefs of Judaism, what is the Bible, etc., that animals have no souls.
Right.
Therefore, killing them is no bad thing.
Right.
Or that there is only single body with which you are born, which you are going to bury when you die, because that very body will be joining your spirit soul on the day of judgment. And then with the same body you will go to hell and heaven or paradise, whatever. There is only a single body, there is no coming back to human life. Am I going to say partly you are right? Answer will be no, you are not right. But am I going to hate you for that? No, I'm not. I'm just giving a small example. Don't take me literally. You can find the similar wrong things with our religion. But in other words, Jains are not so liberal-minded and open-minded and forgiving and all that. I want to correct your wrong impressions you are giving about Jains. You are giving them too much credit.
Well,
Fourth one. What should one do have then for those who are not like us in belief, who we know are wrong in their belief? What should we do for that? Today, I thought I will give it to you or show it to you. There is, if you have time, 5 minutes, I can read it. During the Buddha's time, historically, Buddha's time is Buddha died in 544 BC. He lived to be 80 years old. And in the last 10 years of time, a king at that time, who was a patricide, who has killed his father, Ajatashatru, who comes to Buddha to ask various questions, asking that what is the good of being a recluse like you are, living the household life, etc. And Buddha says, have you been to other people also asking the same question? He said, yes, sir, I have been to 6 different people, 6 different sects at that time, those who were considered either heterodox or orthodox. Jainism is one of them too. Mahavira's name is given. So let me read you one, since I have got the text here. This is translation by Polytech Society people. This fellow, this king, Buddha says, have you asked the same question to others also? He said, yes, I have got. And what did they say? So one by one, he narrates. And I'm going to read you something. And this is what he says. Now the question is now. Then when one day, The king is saying this to the Buddha. I had asked Ajita of the garment of hair. He said, this is the name of the person, Ajita. Kesha Kambali, he has a garment made of hair, okay. Now listen to now what kind, and this is now we are going to be talking about 5th century BC. In Pali language, English translation. There is no such thing, O king, as alms or sacrifice or offering. There is neither fruit nor result of good or evil deeds. There is neither father nor mother, that means you don't owe them any duty. Nor beings springing into life without them, namely heaven or hell, where there are no parents. There are in the world no recluses or Brahmins who have reached the highest point, as they claim, who walk perfectly, and who, having understood and realized by themselves alone both this world and the next, make their wisdom known to others, like the Buddha is doing. But then what is the truth then, according to this fellow? A human being is built up of 4 elements. When he dies, the earthly in him returns and relapses to the earth. The fluid to the water, the heat to the fire, the wind to the air, and his faculties pass into space. The 4 bearers on the bier as a 5th take his dead body away till they reach the burning ground. Men utter 4 eulogies, but there his bones are bleached. I got just half paragraph to read. Because at the end, what the king has to say, that is important. And his offerings end into ashes. It is a doctrine of fools, the gift of gifts, the talk of gifts. It is an empty lie, mere idle talk, when men say there is profit thereon. Fools and wise alike, on the dissolution of the body, are cut off, annihilated, and after death they are not. This is the doctrine, believed by somebody, which is denial of everything.
Right.
What does the king do now? That's the point. When asked what was the fruit in the present state of being of the life of the recluse, expound his theory of total annihilation. Then, O Lord, he says to the Buddha, it occurred to me, how should such a one as I think of giving dissatisfaction to any recluse or Brahmin in my realm? So I neither applauded nor blamed what he said, and though dissatisfied, I gave utterance to no expression of dissatisfaction, and neither accepting nor rejecting that answer of his, I arose from my seat and departed thence. Now,
We have to leave the building by 9.
Okay.
the fourth, therefore, this attitude, this attitude which the king has, that is called Marjastha Bhava, means equanimity.
Right.
Marjastha Bhava is what the Jaina says,
Right.
friendship towards all, etc.
Right.
Fourth one is Marjastha Bhava Viparita Vritta, those who are not holding your view but totally against views, views against yours, towards them you should have total equanimity.
Right.
Equanimity is what the king was showing, that he will neither do this or that, quietly goes. This acceptance, as things are, this is called Marjastha Bhava, equanimity. This is the Anekhanta telling Jains This is how we should behave. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I could quickly respond, I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, we have to
but,
leave the building by 9,
Oh,
before
okay.
9.
So one thing I maybe should have emphasized more, I just mentioned it briefly, is that, traditionally Jain philosophers have not used this philosophy in the way that I would like to see it used. And it's important to distinguish between a contemporary person finding these ideas interesting, wanting to do something else with them, and reflecting accurately, historically, what happened in the tradition. But I've tried to be careful about this in my writing. I know that John Cort and I've had a lot of discussion about this. John Cort wrote an article where he basically debunked the idea that Anikantavada is intellectual ahimsa. Huh? John Cort's article, it was in a journal called Philosophy, East and West. It was in 2005, I believe. I think it's very likely you'll have it, Philosophy East and West, yeah. And what I have argued sort of in response to that is that, yes, historically, you're right, he's right, that's true. But as you say, these ideas also have potential to cultivate certain attitudes. And I think this is a kind of creative employment of them. And there's much more that can be said, but I thank you for coming and for your responding. And that we're probably running out of time. I have thoughts about the one life and rebirth issue too, which you mentioned, but we're probably running out of time. So, all right, thank you all. Thank you.
And also thanks to Zaytuna for allowing us to use the space tonight and for recording the lecture. Thank you.